Hello my friends and welcome to my new video. So in today's video we're going to dive into the painting process of this diorama, which I'm still incredibly happy to say, received a gold medal lately at the Euro Model Expo. But let's get to the point. While we covered the painting of the figures in the last video, today I'll show you step by step how I achieved this realistic muddy trench in a World War I battlefield. So let's start right into it. So today we're taking the last critical step in our diorama build. Painting. And we're starting with a fundamental technique, a black base coat. I'm using my airbrush for a uniform application, ensuring every surface is covered. This base coat is vital for several reasons. Firstly, it provides a strong foundation for our colors, allowing them to adhere better. Secondly, it creates natural shadows and depth, significantly enhancing the realism of the diorama. The dark base allows us to build up highlights and midtones for a richer, more vibrant final result. So let's get our diorama primed and ready for the color layers to come. For this crucial base coat, I'm reaching for my absolute go-to, Argonnerwaldlied one-shot primer. Seriously, this stuff is a game changer. First off, it's non-toxic, which is a huge plus for me. Plus, it sprays like a dream. Slightly thinned, it gives you this incredibly smooth, even finish. As some of you may have noticed, I unintentionally forgot to add the barbed wire. We are now correcting this by using Eduard's photo-etched barbed wire, which offers excellent detail. To facilitate the bending process, I used a controlled heat technique. Brief contact with a lighter flame significantly increases the flexibility of the material and prevents unwanted strange-looking bends. Care must be taken to avoid overheating. The prepared wire sections are then threaded through the posts and a damaged section is worked in to increase the level of detail of the diorama. Once the barbed wire had been primed, it was time to color the ground. I opted for a gradual build-up, starting with the darkest earth colors. I used AK Interactive's dark earth as a base, which I applied in thin layers. This allowed me to emphasize the depth and texture of the soil. The next step was to use dust from Argonnerwaldlied to give the ground a dusty greyish tone and to highlight the raised areas such as the edges of the crater and the mounds of earth. These areas should represent the dry and sunlit areas. Again, I made sure to apply the paint unevenly to create different shades of color. However, because this step desaturated the whole soil very much, I then used the color Light Earth from AK Interactive to add a little more color to the almost black and white appearance. Finally, I used Deck Tan to highlight all other parts of the diorama, such as the sandbags and wooden parts for later painting with a brush. The result still looks very grey and monotonous at the moment, but we will change that in the next step with intensive enamel washes. To breathe some much needed life into the terrain, I started with AK Interactive's Cursed Earth. This rich reddish brown hue perfectly captures the look of disturbed, loamy soil, ideal for our churned up battlefield. For the drier, higher areas, especially the hilltops and crater's edge, I used rain marks effects. For the damp, shady regions, for example in hollows, at the bottom of mounds or in the drainage system of the trench, I then used dark mud. Finally, to achieve more seamless transitions between these tones, I used damp earth. Using Argonnerwald's odorless enamel thinner, I gently blended the colors to create a cohesive and natural looking ground surface. Now to define the wettest and shadiest zones, I strategically employed dark wash and fresh mud. These were carefully applied primarily to the interior of the crater, the lower slopes of the mounds, and in the drainage system of the trench. This targeted application perfectly simulates the natural accumulation of moisture in low-lying areas, resulting in those characteristic dark damp patches. Then I was pleased with this initial ground color scheme. This first pass on the ground has delivered that wet, earthy aesthetic I was aiming for. We'll be adding finer nuances down the line, but for now it provides the right groundwork. So with the floor looking just right, let's move on to tackle the initial wooden components. Here's the color selection I'll be using for the duckboards. Moving on to the wooden elements, my initial step was a thinned application of wood grain to establish a foundational brown tone. Building up on this base, I introduced light earth and new Iraqi army sand to accentuate the natural wood grain and highlight the edges. To integrate the wood's color with the diorama's overall tone and create depth, I then employed enamel washes, primarily earth and dark wash for the shading. At this point, I observed that the wood grain had become somewhat subdued. To address this and achieve a more aged greyish hue, I carefully repainted the grain with an even lighter color, using Deck Tan for the most prominent raised areas. Following this, I reapplied the same animal washes, and this time the wood structure retained its visibility much more effectively. Finally, to impart an authentic vertebrate appearance, I applied a light grey acrylic glaze across the wood surfaces. For the wicker walls, my approach mirrored the wood, but with a slightly more coarser initial layer. I began with a wood grain glaze. This was followed by more substantial applications of light earth, New Iraqi army sand and deck tan, ensuring the outermost surfaces remained the lightest, gradually darkening towards the inner ends of the wicker struts. My focus at this stage was primarily establishing the broad light and shadow patterns. Next, I employed animal washes, predominantly earth and fresh mud, to deepen the color of the wicker walls from the center outwards towards the edges. The very edges and the earth visible between the woven strands became the darkest areas. Once the washes were fully dry, I moved on to the detail work using acrylic paints. With careful concentration, I painted the subtle color variations and texture onto each individual wicker strut. I utilized the same core colors, deck tan, light earth and New Iraqi army sand, while also incorporating leather brown to represent darker sections of bark. Moving on to the fragmented wood scattered by the blast, I aimed for a more aged greyish finish. However, I still employed the same detailed approach as before to preserve the integrity of the wood grain and prevent a uniform appearance. To further enhance the storytelling, I used more green moss wash alongside the usual earth tones. This was a deliberate choice to reflect prolonged contact with damp soil, suggesting the growth of moss and small plant life. This adds subtle yet significant color variations and underscores a wet environment. After all, this diorama is set in a no man's land where the water table was often high. And speaking of harsh environments, the Battle of Flanders in Belgium was particularly notorious for its extreme conditions, where low-lying trenches and defensive lines could have been consistently waterlogged, making combat even more brutal. For the rusted corrugated sheet metal, I decided to reduce the amount of work as it is a small inconspicuous part of the diorama. After a base coat of heavily thinned dark rust, I built up several glazes in lighter rust tones to illustrate varying degrees of corrosion and create visual interest. A subtle grey highlight on the edges followed. Finally, I introduced animal washes like rust streaking effects along with a touch of green moss to impart a slightly weathered and neglected feel to the metal. Moving on to the sandbags, I started with a thin base coat of light earth to establish that linen-like foundation. In the following, I applied different mixtures of light earth and New Iraqi army sand, as well as pure New Iraqi army sand in deliberate strokes to emphasize the raised areas and create initial highlights. Even though the application was still somewhat flat at this stage, I focused on suggesting the basic texture and the direction of the creases with these highlights. For the shadow areas, I then targeted the hollows and used wood grain. This darker brown color was applied to deepen those recesses and importantly also brushed in texture strokes across the highlighted areas to begin building up that fabric feel. For the next layer of detail on the sandbags, I used deck tan to paint very fine, sharp texture lines for the most prominent highlights. I paid attention to applying these lines particularly thinly, really aiming to accentuate the weave and texture of the fabric. Because this step created a significant contrast on the bags, I followed up with a finer glaze of light earth to gently soften those strong transitions and create a more unified surface. As a final touch, I then used New Iraqi army sand to further refine the texture, adding those very last subtle lines. I also incorporated some delicate crisscrossing lines to break up the linear pattern and give the sandbags a truly authentic, woven appearance. With the sandbag texture now finalized, I moved on to accentuate the seams along the edges using deck tan. To seamlessly integrate the sandbags with the surrounding ground and create clear definition between individual bags, I employed the same animal washes I used for the terrain, primarily earth. In the areas where the sandbags made contact with or rested up on the ground, I carefully blended in earth and in some instances also black wash. This was crucial for creating realistic transitions and grounding shadows, making the sandbags feel firmly planted in the scene. I deliberately played with different colors for the blankets in the diorama, mainly blue, green and brown. While brown and beige tones naturally go well with undyed blankets and fabrics, I also wanted to use the blankets to add specific color accents to the otherwise rather beige-brown diorama so that they wouldn't blend in. So I painted the blankets in these colors. The technique was quite simple. After a base color, I added very soft highlights to the raised areas to emphasize the shape. I deliberately kept these highlights very soft to ensure a smooth transition. I even experimented with drying retarder, but found that it worked better for me to work with very thin layers of color to achieve soft transitions through multiple coats. Finally, I integrated the blankets into the diorama using the same enamel washes and added more or less dirt depending on their position. Now comes the stage where the churned up earth truly springs to life. I painted every minute detail within the soil, the individual stones, exposed roots, broken stalks and scattered sticks, using a range of contrasting colors. These stones received varied shades of grey, from deep grey to deck tan, alongside natural browns, beiges and khaki tones. This precise and delicate coloring of each element makes them stand out distinctly from the surrounding earth, adding a significant layer of depth and dimension to the entire diorama. It's this very attention to the smallest of details that really takes the base to the next level. You might have spotted these little tin cans I added earlier. They just need their labels to complete the look. So I've now applied these as decals. After the usual water bath to release them, I carefully brush them onto each can. To make sure they really stick and conform to the plastic, I used a decal solution. Now here's a little tricky bit. Because of how the cans are placed, I couldn't just wrap the decals all the way around. That meant I had to get in there with a super sharp scalpel and trim the bottom edge of each decal precisely against the diorama surface. Now it was time to introduce some life into the scene by painting the vegetation. For this I utilized a variety of green tones, and for the brightest highlights I mixed in a touch of buff. I began with the blades of grass, establishing a base with dark green, and then accentuating the stems with a lighter shade. I followed a similar approach for the other plants. Onto a darker green undercoat I applied the lighter green to the upper surfaces of the individual leaves to make them stand out. Subsequently, I attempted, with varying degrees of success, to bring out the leaf structures and details using very fine brush strokes and a mixture of green and deck tan. Alright, time to paint these tree trunks. I wanted them to be really desaturated and light, so they would blend nicely into the overall look of the diorama. I began by applying a black wash over the pre-shaded surface to further accentuate the recessed areas and bark texture. Then I moved on to the familiar wood tones, working in the direction of the original trunk texture and building up from darker to lighter. First old wood, followed by light earth, new Iraqi army sand and finally deck tan, applying the lightest tones particularly to the edges and where the trunk met contrasting elements. However, I observed that the trunk appeared overly grey and desaturated, struggling to stand out against the background due to the similar color palette used elsewhere. To rectify this, I applied an acrylic glaze using wood grain and dark grey brown. This brought in more of a brown tone and selectively highlighted the textures in certain areas, effectively adding warmth and definition where needed. Moving on to the exposed wood within the trunk, distinct from the bark, I employed a slightly modified approach leaning towards warmer, yellowish reddish tones to create a clear visual contrast. The base color was light earth, followed by new Iraqi army sand to bring out the highlights. To define the edges and introduce a richer, more reddish wood tone, I used wood grain. For the final subtle highlights, I selectively applied deck tan to emphasize the grain and wood structure, using a more delicate touch compared to the bark. While some colors overlapped with those used for the bark, the overall emphasis here was on the warmer hues. Finally, I used the familiar enamel washes to seamlessly connect the trunk to the ground and to achieve a greater sense of three-dimensionality through targeted shading, particularly at the base. With the tree trunks complete, I shifted my focus to the barbed wire. I began by priming it with a light grey. Then I applied a very thin wash of dark rust over the entire wire to establish the initial signs of corrosion. To add highlights, I then used a thin application of deck tan on the raised areas to accentuate them. To really intensify that aged, rusty appearance, I then applied a rusty enamel wash And with that, the barbed wire was done. Then I've turned my attention to the trench periscope, which we built from scratch in the build video. Rather than simply listing each individual color, I want to explain the overall idea behind its paint job. I aim to make this periscope visually striking. To achieve this, I approached each distinct segment of the periscope as a separate canvas, ensuring it would stand out from its neighbors. My technique for this was color modulation applied to each segment individually. Lighter towards the top, graduating to darker tones in the center, and then lightening again towards the edges. I repeated this process with numerous thin layers of color, patiently building up the contrast between the segments until it became clearly defined and visually impactful. To ensure smooth and seamless transitions between these modulated areas, I repeatedly glazed over the individual segments with very thin layers of color. Once the finer details were picked out, the periscope achieved the cinematic look I was after. Nevertheless, I also think it looks a little too metallic. Moving on to the Maschinengewehr 08, I began with the familiar pre-shading technique. Following the black primer, I airbrushed Deck 10 from above to predefine the highlights and shadows, making the subsequent color application more intuitive. My color palette for the machine gun centered primarily on green for the majority of the metallic surfaces, the cooling water jacket and the stand, and dark gray for the main body. I started with the green areas using AK's extra dark green as a base. Employing color modulation, I gently lightened the upward facing surfaces with thin progressive layers of the same green mixed with a touch of lighter green, while shading the undersides and hollows with a darker tone mixed with black. I wet blended these transitions to achieve smooth gradients. The rivets and finer details on the machine gun were then picked out with Deck 10 to add visual interest. Finally, I applied washes to enhance the three-dimensionality of the weapon and to add dirt to the feet of the stand. To make this grime appear even more authentic, I brushed the underside of the machine gun stand with AK Diorama's muddy ground acrylic paste, and once dry, I treated it with the same enamel washes used on the diorama floor to create a cohesive muddy impression. With all the individual elements painted, the exciting stage of final assembly could finally begin. However, to seamlessly integrate the machine gun into the diorama and ensure it truly looked connected to the scene, rather than just placed on top, some minor adjustments in the application of acrylic paste were still required. This was primarily because I hadn't finalized these fine-tuning details before the painting process. Ideally, of course, these adjustments are made beforehand to save on extra work. But sometimes the need for changes only becomes apparent later or when the precise positioning isn't yet absolutely locked in. So here you see me applying acrylic paste again to blend the machine gun stand into the ground. And I also modeled footprints for one of the figures to further embed them in the scene. The figures themselves were painted in a previous video, so be sure to check that out if you are interested in their painting process. I then positioned the ammunition canister alongside the machine gun. All the areas that required repainting as a result of the adjustments were then treated using the same techniques as before, which is why I won't delve into those specific steps again now. With the assembly largely complete, the final touch was placing the figures in the diorama using superglue. I'm really pleased with how they now integrate into the scene, lying and seemingly stuck in the churned earth exactly as intended. For the machine gun's cartridge belt, I used an absolutely fantastic 3D decal from Quinta Studios. The quality of this thing is truly outstanding, and it's made a world of difference compared to the self-made belt I showed you in the build video. The machine gun still needed its water hose connected to the canister, which I fashioned from a pre-bent piece of copper wire and then painted to match. As a final detail, I scattered spent cartridge cases around the diorama. And here's a little tip from me. These particular ones weren't worth the expense. Even under this macro lens, you can see that the same effect could easily be achieved by simply cutting a thin wire into uniform pieces. A definite pass from me on these. If you're aiming on depict unfired cartridges, then investing in such detailed products might be worthwhile for certain projects. But for empty casings, definitely not. I secured them in place using VMS sand and ballistries. To finalize the figures, I applied a touch of weathering, adapting them to the muddy environment by using the same enamel washes as on the base, specifically fresh mud and earth as well as rain marks effect. And for the very last little detail to bring this scene to life, a water puddle created with AK Puddles acrylic. Now, this stuff requires some serious patience. It shrinks as it dries, so it's all about thin layers. Over several days, I slowly built up the puddle, letting each layer harden completely until I had the size and shape I wanted right there in the center. To break up that perfectly smooth surface and add a bit of visual interest, I used acrylic gel to create some subtle waves and flow. Whether they're from nearby explosions, the rumble of the machine gun 08, or just the breeze catching the water, that's for you to decide. And as we reach the end of the video, I want to extend my deepest and most heartfelt thanks once again to my incredible patrons. Your support is truly invaluable and plays a massive role in helping me bring more projects like this to life here on the channel. I'm endlessly grateful for each and every one of you. On my Patreon page, which is a fantastic way to further support this channel, you'll also find exclusive perks waiting for you, including exclusive content and early access to ad-free videos a full week before they go live here. Your support genuinely makes all the difference. And with that, the diorama is officially finished. Time for the grand reveal. And once again, the music accompanying this final reveal is a version of the Argonnerwald song, this time the third and final variation I'll be featuring. This particular rendition by the Spartakists, created in 1919 during the revolutionary movements, presents a lyrically completely different adaptation, which I find very appealing musically. The Spartakists were a socialist far-left movement striving for a revolution modeled on the Russian November Revolution, and they also represented a significant voice within the movement advocating for an end to the First World War in Germany.
Januar um Mitternacht, ein schwarzer Käfer